You think you're so clever, don't you? The words, laced with a saccharine sweetness I'd come to loathe, dripped from her lips like venom. It was the casualness that struck me first, the utter lack of any discernible emotion beyond a smug, self-satisfied amusement. She was perched on the edge of the antique Persian rug, a glass of Merlot clutched in her hand, its deep ruby color mirroring the bruised feeling settling in my gut. My living room, usually a sanctuary of muted light and worn leather, suddenly felt suffocating, the familiar scent of lemon polish and old books replaced by the cloying perfume she always wore. This was Tuesday. Our weekly family dinner, a ritual of forced politeness and veiled criticisms, was just beginning. My husband, David, sat across from me, his usual jovial demeanor muted, his gaze flickering between his sister and me, a silent question in his eyes. My own hands, usually busy with preparing the roast, lay dormant in my lap, my fingers unconsciously tracing the seams of my trousers. For years, I'd navigated the intricate minefield that was Eleanor. Our lives had been intertwined since David and I married a decade ago. She was the younger sibling, the one who'd always been coddled, the delicate flower who needed constant tending. Her world was a carefully curated facade of effortless charm and expensive taste, funded entirely by her husband's family, who'd made their fortune in, well, that was always vague. Something about industrial investments. David, bless him, saw only the sister he'd grown up with, the one who'd cried on his shoulder after every minor setback. I saw the carefully constructed edifice, the cracks that only became apparent when you looked closely enough. There was the time, about 5 years ago, when my parents passed away within months of each other. The inheritance was modest, but to Eleanor, it was a windfall. I'd spent weeks going through my mother's belongings, each photograph a pang, each trinket a memory. Eleanor, meanwhile, had shown up with a meticulously itemized list of what she believed was rightfully hers, down to the chipped porcelain shepherdess my grandmother had cherished. She'd even tried to claim a set of silver spoons that my mother had explicitly bequeathed to me in her will, citing a vague family tradition that only she seemed to recall. David had smoothed it over, as he always did, telling me to let it go, that it wasn't worth the fight. But I remembered the gleam in her eyes as she catalogued her perceived spoils, the way she'd held the spoons as if they were already hers, a small, possessive tremor in her fingers. Then there was the incident with the charity gala. I'd spent months volunteering, meticulously organizing the silent auction that was meant to raise funds for a local children's hospital. Eleanor had promised a significant donation, a grand gesture that would undoubtedly earn her accolades. On the night of the event, she'd arrived late, a whirlwind of silken diamonds, and casually announced that her donation would be made in person next week, as she'd had a sudden, unexpected expense. The hospital's director, a kind woman whose face was etched with worry, had looked crestfallen. Later, David had let slip that Eleanor had been on a spontaneous shopping spree in Paris, her unexpected expense a limited edition handbag. The look on his face when I confronted him, the subtle shift from obliviousness to a sort of weary resignation, told me everything I needed to know. He knew. He just didn't want to see it. But this latest revelation, the one that had hung in the air like a storm cloud for the past month, was different. It concerned the very core of David's professional life. He worked for a financial firm, one that handled a considerable amount of public funds. There had been whispers, rumors of irregularities, of investments that seemed too good to be true. I'd stumbled upon some encrypted files on David's work laptop, downloaded them out of a vague unease, and spent sleepless nights piecing them together. It was a Ponzi scheme, meticulously crafted, designed to siphon millions from unsuspecting investors. The mastermind? Eleanor's husband, a man I'd only ever seen as a silent, imposing presence at family gatherings. And Eleanor, the ever-supportive wife, had been his willing accomplice, her charm and connections facilitating the deception. The sheer audacity of it, the calculated betrayal of trust, had sickened me. I'd presented David with my findings, my voice trembling, my hands slick with sweat. He'd initially dismissed it as my overactive imagination, my suspicion of his sister. But the evidence was undeniable. The spreadsheets, the coded communications, the offshore account transfers, they painted a damning picture. He'd spent days in a daze, grappling with the reality of his brother-in-law's criminal enterprise and his sister's complicity. And then, a week ago, he'd received a call from his law. The firm had discovered the fraud. An internal investigation was launched. David, due to his position, was scrutinized. Eleanor, who had a tangential connection to the firm through her husband's business dealings, was also brought in. And that's how I found myself sitting here, listening to her venom. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. David's face was ashen. He hadn't spoken a word since Eleanor had delivered her opening salvo. She took another sip of wine, her eyes never leaving mine. The smirk played on her lips, a predator's grin. You know, she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, it's funny how things work out. I was just appointed to a special oversight committee at the SEC. They're really looking into this whole mess. Someone has to clean it up, right? The implications slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The SEC. The Securities and Exchange Commission. The very body responsible for investigating and prosecuting financial fraud. She hadn't just been complicit, she'd actively benefited from the scheme, and now, she was being placed in charge of its investigation. The irony was so thick, so grotesque, it felt like a nightmare. And the someone has to clean it up was a direct jab at me, at my own quiet efforts to expose the truth. She was taking my discovery, my sleepless nights, my moral imperative, and twisting it into her own narrative, her own stepping stone. The air in the room thickened, charged with an unspoken animosity. David shifted in his seat, a low groan escaping his lips. Eleanor, oblivious or perhaps reveling in his distress, continued her monologue, detailing the exciting challenges of her new role, the importance of impartiality and due diligence. Each word was a fresh wound, each carefully chosen phrase a testament to her incredible ability to spin even the darkest of situations to her advantage. I could feel the bile rising in my throat, a potent mixture of disgust and a dawning, chilling resolve. My mind, however, was no longer focused on Eleanor's pronouncements. It was a cold, calm battlefield. I saw it then, a clear, sharp image, Eleanor, on the witness stand, her face impassive, her carefully constructed composure unwavering as she testified to the details of the fraud, effectively condemning her husband and, by extension, implicating anyone even remotely associated with him. The thought of her power, the power she now wielded through her fabricated position, was unbearable. But beneath the horror, a different kind of feeling began to bloom. A quiet, steely determination. She had made her move. Now, it was my turn. I stood up, the scrape of the chair on the hardwood floor unnervingly loud in the charged silence. David looked at me, his eyes wide with a silent plea. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, the smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. I'm going to get some air, I said, my voice level, devoid of the tremor that had threatened to betray me moments before. I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and out the front door, the cool night air a welcome balm against my overheated skin. I didn't walk far. Just to the edge of our manicured lawn, where the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving with a practiced speed. I'd been preparing for this. Not for this specific scenario, perhaps, but for the inevitable fallout, for Eleanor's capacity for utter ruthlessness. I'd anticipated the need for a decisive countermove, a way to neutralize her advantage before she could fully leverage it. My fingers danced across the screen, navigating through encrypted folders, accessing a secure cloud storage. I'd spent weeks painstakingly gathering every scrap of evidence that linked Eleanor directly to the fraud. It wasn't just the Ponzi scheme itself, but her active participation in laundering the funds, her offshore shell companies, her coded communications with her husband that detailed the movement of illicit money. I hadn't just found the files on David's laptop, I'd gone deeper, using David's unwitting access to trace the money's origin and destination, a painstaking process that had consumed my nights and weekends. The information was damning, irrefutable, and more importantly, it bypassed any potential influence she might wield at the SEC. I uploaded the entire package to a secure, anonymous drop point, a platform known for its discretion. Then, with a few more taps, I sent a single, untraceable email to the investigative journalist who had, a few months prior, broken the story on a smaller financial scandal. The subject line was simple: $9 million fraud. Evidence package attached. Your contact at the SEC is compromised. I didn't include my name, my contact information, or any identifying details. The journalist, a tenacious bloodhound known for her investigative prowess, would understand. She owed me a favor, a small one, from a previous unrelated matter, where I'd anonymously provided her with a lead. Back inside, the air was still thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor was now explaining, with great theatricality, how she planned to root out corruption, how her own impeccable ethics would guide her. David sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. I walked back into the dining room, my steps silent. I didn't sit down. I simply stood by the doorway, my gaze fixed on Eleanor. She paused her impassioned speech, sensing my presence. Her eyes met mine again, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Then, I saw it. The subtle shift. The almost imperceptible widening of her pupils. The slight tremor in her hand as she raised her wine glass to her lips. It was the moment the realization dawned, the cold, hard truth seeping into her carefully constructed reality. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The knowledge that the evidence was out there, beyond her reach, beyond her influence, was enough. I simply turned and walked out of the dining room, out of the house, and into the quiet night. I drove to a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, the kind where the neon sign flickered erratically and the carpets smelled faintly of stale cigarettes. I checked in under a fake name, paid cash, and disappeared into the anonymity of a cheap room. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly. It was David, frantic texts mixed with unheard calls. Then came the barrage from Eleanor's friends, the flying monkeys, calling me a traitor, a monster, a destructive force. The media storm hit like a tidal wave. The journalist I'd contacted had done her job with ruthless efficiency. The story broke, not just about the $9 million fraud, but about the SEC investigators' alleged conflict of interest, her husband's indictment, and the damning evidence of her own complicity. The SEC, faced with an undeniable public outcry and irrefutable proof, had no choice. Eleanor was suspended, then swiftly fired, her carefully cultivated reputation shattered. Her husband's trial was swift and brutal, the evidence I'd provided leaving him with no room for maneuver. David, while cleared of any wrongdoing in the firm's investigation, found himself in an untenable position, forever associated with the scandal. He eventually resigned, his career in tatters. The money, the ill-gotten gains Eleanor had so desperately tried to protect, was seized, much of it recovered for the defrauded investors. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a ghost in the machine. There were no triumphant pronouncements, no cathartic tears. Just a quiet, profound sense of closure. I'd seen the monster for what she was, and I'd refused to let her consume us. I'd endured the years of manipulation, the veiled insults, the constant undercurrent of deceit. And when the moment came, I hadn't lashed out in anger. I'd acted with precision, with a cold, calculated resolve that mirrored her own. The satisfaction wasn't in her ruin, not entirely. It was in the quiet execution of justice, in the dismantling of a false narrative, in the restoration of a fragile balance. Eleanor, the woman who had always believed herself untouchable, the one who reveled in her privilege and manipulated those around her with effortless grace, was brought down not by a public outcry, but by the silent, meticulous work of a woman she'd underestimated for years. The fraud was exposed. The accomplice was fired. And the quiet retribution, delivered without a single raised voice, was complete. The world Eleanor had so carefully constructed, built on a foundation of lies and deceit, had crumbled, leaving her exposed and utterly alone. And in that silence, for the first time in a long time, I felt a profound sense of peace.